So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course titled The Novel and Change. We'll have the concluding sessions on Sitsi Dangaramba's novel Nervous Conditions. So on the screen you'll see an essay called Transgressing Boundaries, Marginality, Complicity and Subversion in Nervous Conditions by Sheena Apache. Now the reason why we're looking at this essay in some details is because it offers a really interesting close reading of the novel in question, but also it offers some very original interpretations of hysteria in terms of looking at hysteria not as a mode of silencing, not as a mode of marginalization, but rather as a mode of articulation, which can potentially become an act of resistance. Right, so we looked at how already there's a lot of interesting relationship between female agency, female embodiment in relation to the collusive structures of control and coercion which operate with patriarchy. And we looked at an essay where we compare the two novels, Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart and Nervous Conditions by Dangaramba, in terms of looking at how the colonial missionary institution, or the missionary educational institution, ends up being collusive with the erstwhile patriarchal structures in Shona society. So that was an interesting way to look at the novel. But what we have already seen is how hysteria or nervousness or neurosis plays a very important role in the novel, which is why it's called Nervous Conditions as in terms of a title. But what this essay will allow us to do is to look at how nervousness may also be seen as an act of iteration, or hysteria as an act of iteration, which is potentially subversive in quality. So on your screen, we look at how the essay sets out to do what it sets out to do, and the introduction itself summarizes its aims and objectives. So, as was mentioned here, this paper seeks to explore the various ways in which nervous conditions foregrounds the heterogeneity of women's voices within an African context. By emphasizing the various levels of complicity with and resistance to patriarchy and colonialism, the novel negates the notion that African women's voices constitute a homogeneous third world voice, right? So the negation of homogeneity is important over here because what it does as a matter of rewriting or representation is it foregrounds the heterogeneity, the polyphony, and the heteroglossic quality of female voices in nervous conditions, moving away dramatically as well as discursively from a homogeneous monolithic understanding of female subjectivity in the African context, right? So there's nothing called the homogeneous third world voice, which is a very interesting and convenient strategy to subjugate and classify and reify certain forms of identity in the African context. Now, what this essay sets out to do is just the opposite. It foregrounds the plurality, the polyphony, and the differential relationships, even in an intra-familial setting. So even within the one family, we have so many different kinds of female agency, female articulations, that it becomes almost morally imperative to foreground the difference. So Nervous Conditions uses a multi-layered textuality to negate the homogenizing effects of recuperating a singular voice from the margin, right? So there's no singularity, there's no singular monolithic essentialized voice from the margin that may be conveniently redeemed. The novel uses the voices of 4 female characters and a female narrator focalizer to tell the interweaving stories. So the female focalizer is important, the focal point through which the integrated narrative mechanism operates or works is a female point of view as well. So there are these different polyphonic frameworks, all female, which tell differential experiential accounts under this post-colonial condition. It may therefore be seen to privilege diversity and heterogeneity, where the emphasis is not on a naive return to origin, but on retrieval, rediscovery, and reinvention, right? So again, retrieval, rediscovery, and reinvention. So there's this constructive quality, reconstructive quality, which is always there in this novel. And it's not really a naively nostalgic novel, because nostalgia obviously becomes a very problematic category because it reifies the past, it romanticizes the past in a way which is uncritical. And the uncriticality of certain forms of nostalgia actually ends up generating a very homogeneous, a very essentialized idea of identity, which obviously Dangarembga wants to encounter or to counter and deconstruct. This article also argues that hysteria is not a place of silence. That's an important bit that we must look at, and I mentioned this already. It refuses to look at hysteria as a mode of silence or silencing, and rather it becomes a site of resistance. It becomes a site of an alternate form of embodiment, an alternate form of articulation. By using various screens of hysteria, nervous conditions challenges the conventional ideas that surround hysteria. In the novel, the hysteria experienced by female characters ruptures their ability, the stability of both patriarchy and colonialism, right? So you find how patriarchy and colonialism, both obviously very, very male, masculinist apparatus in close collusion with patriarchy, are problematized and interrupted to different modes of hysteria. So as you can see, this essay really takes a very original take on hysteria, original interpretation of hysteria in terms of refusing to look at hysteria as a site of silence, a site of marginalization, but rather a site of reiteration, a site of reconstruction, a site of a production of an alternate model of embodiment, right? Which is something which interrupts and defamiliarizes the traditional patriarchal processes. The female body, maligned and inscribed by patriarchal and colonial practice, becomes a powerful site of resistance in the novel. So the resistance which is performed in some sense with hysteria becomes a very important trope in this novel, almost a representational strategy, one might say. While I'm aware that both male and female characters in the novel suffer hysteria, I wish to analyze hysteria in black female colonized subjects, right? So the double marginalization over here, as we have mentioned, is important, and obviously Dangarembga offers a story, offers a focal point from the doubly marginalized point, from the doubly marginalized subject situation, as opposed to the male position that Okonkwo has in Achebe's Things Fall Apart. The intention, however, is not to exaggerate the historically feminized etymology of hysteria. Rather, I wish to suggest that hysteria should be read as a position of revolt that causes upheaval. So the word revolt is important over here. Hysteria can be revolting, as in it can be the sort of point of resistance which really offers some kind of a defamiliarizing strategy apropos of traditional frameworks of patriarchy. My stance is informed by both Louis Irigaray and Kaia Silverman. So Irigaray and Silverman obviously writing from a feminist post-structuralist position, and also from the position of hysteria, and how hysteria can be seen as a mode of articulation and embodiment, are drawn on. In this context, therefore, I disagree with critics and theorists who maintain that hysteria is a space of silent self-defeat. So that traditional mode of hysteria, which is seen as an absence, really, an absence of articulation, as an absence of agency. So that reading is resisted over here. That reading is deconstructed over here. Hysteria in the novel assumes various forms. Its most intense form is anorexia and bulimia. So again, we can see how bodily actions, such as anorexia, eating less and starving oneself, and bulimia, which is the opposite of that, these become these bodily, banal, metabolic, corporeal activities that are also seen in some sense as strategies of resistance, strategies of iteration of agency. And more banally, angelic housewifely submission, as in the case of My Guru, the horizontal violence of naming woman witches and bad nerves, which accompany playing the part of the good kafir or the colonizer's imagination. So we can see how racist epithets are equated with very sexist epithets, so witches, and equated with bad nerves, so hysterics, and of course the good kafir or the colonizer's imaginations. All these different kind of triangulation between race, medical condition, and the female subject position are used over here to create certain kinds of identity markers, which are then resisted and given voice to in different ways from a position of hysteria. Well, I concede that the banal form of hysteria, or banal forms of hysteria that the male characters experience, it is significant that the hysteria is literally passed off into the female characters in the novel. In Baba's case, his bad nerves silence both dissent and significantly laughter, right? So the silencing of dissent is used in terms of the male hysterics in a novel. So any possibility of dissent, any possibility of disagreement, and more importantly, any possibility of mockery is resisted from the male position very conveniently with the male neurotic condition. Furthermore, the hapless Jeremiah proves his mettle by dispiriting his wife. This makes him bold enough to be excited by the thought of possessing a woman like Lucia. It was like possessing a thunderstorm to make it crackle and thunder and lightning at his command, right? So again, the whole idea of possessing a woman and possessing forces of nature are equated over here, and one can kind of dial back to the desire in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein as well, in terms of how Victor Frankenstein, in terms of creating a new species, wants to dismantle female agency and also control in complete totality the workings of nature, right? So the workings of nature being feminized, nature being feminized, it becomes some kind of a metaphor for male coercion, male appropriation of the female reproductive process. So here too, possessing a woman is equated with possessing natural elements. Now, there are some scholarships or scholarly works which are referred to here, but they're also deconstructed and read away from. So Biman Basu notes that the central trope of the novel is entrapment, rebellion, and escape. I would like to suggest that such a reading implies a linearity which appears to be at odds with the structures of the text and is unnecessarily motivated by cause and effect, right? So the whole idea of linearity is something which should be deconstructed, because in Dangarembga's novel, linearity is equated with patriarchy, or sequentiality is equated with patriarchal institutional frameworks of time, right? So the idea of linearity, or the assumption of linearity, should also be deconstructed, and instead what appears in a novel is a sense of cyclicity, a sense of recursivity, which should be foregrounded. While taking cognizance of the trope that Basu identifies, I would also like to read the novel in terms of the various ways in which it seeks to walk towards Bryce's categories of retrieval, rediscovery, and reinvention. So these three words are very important: retrieval, rediscovery, and reinvention. So you notice how the word re is often hyphenated over here, which obviously implies the textual, material, discursive designs which are invested in the process of rediscovery and reinvention. So the temporal designs, the discursive designs, and so on and so forth. These categories are harnessed to the narrative structure of the novel, because while Tambuzai, the adult narrator, quietly, unobtrusively, and extremely fitfully comes to question things, she is pitted against the shifting focalization of a younger Tambu, right? So the different focal points interesting, and sometimes they are at odds with each other. So the same self is situated in different temporal diachronic points, and the differential situations, sometimes they play against each other, they undercut each other, they offset each other, but they also supplement each other in very strategic ways. Through this technique, the text brings various ironies and ambiguities into play. The word play is important because the ludic quality through which irony is produced, through which paradoxes are produced, also become important, especially in a deconstructive text like Nervous Conditions. Although couched as a coming-of-age and journey novel, neither of these processes is linear. Narrative shifts between the focalizers and narrators, and shifts between the narrative present and the narrator's past occur in the novel. So there's a multi-temporal structure, a multi-narrative structure in the novel, which obviously creates some kind of a split personality structure over here. It's not like self is linear or static or monolithic over here. So there's a sense of a fluid self, a sense of a fractured self, a sense of a nervous self. So it's just like nerves spread all across the screen, if we use T.S. Eliot metaphor, which is very similar to what happens in this novel as well. in terms of how the nervous conditions are, they correspond to the subjective conditions in a novel. These shifts are compounded through the circularity of the story that Tambo tells, because it begins where it ends. The story that I've told here is my own story, the story of four women whom I loved, and our men. This story is how it all began, right? So the sense of ending is also a sense of beginning. The sense of linearity is also a sense of circularity. So the different geometries of storytelling, different geometries of self-formation and reformation in the novel, which is why, if you look at the title in a very literal, medical, scientific way, nervous conditions is also a design of nerves in terms of how nerves are spread all across the body, in terms of how neurons and synapses, the gap between neurons, they are spread in a very distributive way, in a very interconnected, intersectional way across a particular organism. Similarly, there are many stories. There's a polyphony of voices, a polyphony of presence in a novel, which spread like nerves. There's a sort of decentering, a distributive quality that characterizes the self-formation and reformation in the novel, which is why this particular essay is important, because the way it looks at hysteria as an act of transgression, which is why it's called transgressing boundaries. It's not really an act of coercion, an act of silencing, an act of marginalization, but can be an act of counter iteration, an act of resistance, which can potentially become subversive in quality. So consequently, it may be argued that a story that Tambo tells attempts to challenge the debilitating generality of the object status of the woman, which robs them of agency, right? So the whole idea of agency-lessness, which is inscribed to the woman, through which women are projected and presented and characterized, is deconstructed in this novel. It's challenged in the novel, and hysteria sometimes becomes the site of the challenge. By telling the stories of four women of different age and status, the novel interrogates the very margin that it writes from. The novel shows that a margin is neither monolithic nor unified, but is instead a wide expanse of physical, psychological, and intellectual space, with its own dynamics and contradictions. The so-called margin is an immense heterogeneous space. So the heterogeneity of the margin. So just because all these women inhabit a marginalized presence doesn't mean there is a category of the woman or the marginalized woman in the novel. There are different forms of marginalization, different degrees of marginalization, which are at play with each other here. And the differential location of the margin, the differential function of the margin is also to be taken into account. The multivocality lent to the novel through harnessing the stories of four women told by Tambuzai challenges the various ways in which the African women's stories have been silenced through both patriarchal and colonial meta-narrativity. So the meta-narrative quality, which is the sort of grand narrative quality of colonialism, has often always been just male in quality, right? So the maleness of the meta-narrative of colonialism is also critiqued over here to a large extent. It also becomes obvious that post-independent Africa does not really create that many opportunities for women's stories. In this regard, Eric Boehmer suggests that, and there's a quotation from Boehmer, the unshackling of the African continent from colonial rule has precluded a corresponding full emancipation of women. In the iconographies of nation-states, there are a few positive roles on offer for women that are not stereotypes and not connected in some way to women's biological capacity for mothering, right? So the various sexist stereotypes to which women are depicted is also worth noticing over here. There's this mother woman, the nurturing woman, and women who are supposed to raise children. So that has often become a staple through which the African women have been represented or characterized. So Boehmer's position here is very important because she talks about the need to create differential characterization of women in the post-colonial African context, which is something that Dangarembga sets out to do because in nervous conditions, even in an intra-familiar setting, we have different kinds of women, different kinds of female voices, which are at play sometimes at odds with each other. I would also argue that it is no longer tenable to consider hysteria a space of silence that is anterior to the symbolic order of language. Hysteria should instead be seen as a space of refusal and revolt, right? So the idea of rejection from hysteria, the idea of refusal from hysteria is also important, because then it gives hysteria some kind of a narrative and performative and corporeal agency through which resistance may be enacted. If hysteria is seen as unintelligible, then it is because the symbolic chooses to see it as such. The symbolic, therefore, relegates hysteria to a position of unintelligibility, anterior to the symbolic, and therefore marginalized. Right? So we see how the marginalization of hysteria is a very convenient category, is a very convenient semantic strategy from the position of the symbolic, the hegemonic symbolic, right? So the hegemonic symbolic, so we see how we are looking at a parallel between the political and the semiotic over here. So in the hegemonic symbolic semiotic order, hysteria is seen as something outside the symbolic, uncanny, outside the home, unhomely, which then is obviously connected and equated very conveniently with unintelligibility, right? But of course, what we see instead this kind of reading that we have here in this particular essay, how hysteria should also be seen as an act of resistance, as an alternate form of iteration, which is not really some kind of a pre-symbolic or pre-linguistic order, right? So that reading is, is deconstructed. In this respect, I concur with Irigary's position that the symptoms of hysteria indicate that violations have occurred, and symbolic language is not always able to articulate this. In such instances, the body must speak for itself, right? So the whole idea of body iteration, or the corporeality of iteration, the viscerality of iteration, becomes important because it moves away from the imperative of using language to iterate. So this becomes not just prelingual in some sense, but also postlingual, right? So the non-linguistic mode of articulation, the non-linguistic mode of iteration, which can potentially become subversive, which can potentially become transgressive in quality, which is why this essay is titled as Transgressive Boundaries. So both Irigary and Lyotard serve the new ways we found to speak such violence. Consequently, rather than seeing hysteria as anterior to the symbolic order, woman's desires and the pain of its disarticulation should be seen as threatening the masculine symbolic order. So it becomes a threat to the patriarchal processes of meaning making or meaning consumption, which is why hysteria becomes as a mode of alternate articulation, right, which can be potentially subversive and which can be counter-essentializing in quality. Women, therefore, do not have to remain mutely positioned beyond the signifying practices of the symbolic as it blanks in discourse. So women should not be seen, or the hysteric should not be seen as just a blank, as just one blunt blank in an otherwise seamless chain of discourse, right? So that kind of reading is absolutely refuted and deconstructed. Since women's subjectivities begin with the body, a body which is inscribed by patriarchal discursive practice, it is significant that this body rebel against the practices that define and constrain it. Moreover, Irigary's work on hysteria reconceptualizes the affirmative potential of the bodily crisis and inserts woman as an active site of signification, right? So the woman becomes a site of signification. So the site quality is important over here because the idea of the subversive site is very, very important. Because what happens, and again, coming as we do from Irigary's work here, we're drawing on it very heavily, this post-structuralist performative quality of hysteria lends it a very important agentic quality, which is otherwise denied to it because of its easy equation with silence, easy equation with erasure, an easy equation with an absolute eradication of agency. But rather, hysteria becomes moored to articulate alternate models of agency, alternate moments of articulation, right, or iteration, which are connected to different forms of identification and identity projection. So, by foregrounding the histories of women, nervous conditions not only challenges the few positive roles on offer for women, but also uses the stereotyped, maligned, colonized, and abused body of the African woman as a site of resistance. For example, while Mashingai, whose body and mind, by her own admission, belong to Baba, appears to be the most oppressed of the women in the novel, she sees the virulence of the Englishness that seduces her children and enfeebles her husband in the presence of Baba. And while she appears to be helpless, she's actually a powerful challenge to the patriarchy. So this is a characteristic of almost all good literary works, how the difference between the absolutely helpless, the absolutely agencyless, and the potentially subversive is always not very clear. So Mashingai, who is this otherwise very docile, submissive, oppressed woman in the novel, also offers in very paradoxical positions a challenge to patriarchy, a challenge to that form of patriarchy which is collusive with colonialism. When she hears that despite Namo's death, and after he's taken to the mission by Baba, Jeremiah has consented that Tambi should go to the mission. Mashingai is distraught. She refuses to eat and is soon unable to eat because the food sat heavily in her stomach. She refuses to cultivate fields, even though she realizes that her plot is what feeds her family. She realizes that through Baba, her children are being cultivated by the colonialists. Her resistance to colonialism and struggle to keep her children is contrasted to Baba's mother, who, being sagacious and having foresight, had begged the holy wizards to prepare him for life in their world. Soon Baba becomes a good boy, cultivable, to yield harvest, to sustain the cultivator. So we'll stop at this point in this particular session, but it's important to just spend a couple of minutes talking about how the agricultural metaphors, the cultivating metaphors, and the child rearing metaphors, the child grooming metaphors in terms of bringing up a child are equated with each other. How the vocabulary used may be applied to harvest, to cultivation, to different forms of irrigation, and also to bring up a child. So bringing up a child and bringing up a crop are equated and compared with each other. But what's also interesting here is to see how the rejection of food, which is also one of the quote-unquote symptoms of hysteria, can also be seen as an act of resistance. The rejection of nourishment, the rejection of food, the refusal to cultivate that which will nourish, can also become systems of resistance or moments of resistance against patriarchal institutional orders. So you find it's beginning to get clear how nervous conditions talks about nervousness not just as a pathological condition of absence or pathological condition of loss, but also as a site of rebellion, a site of reconstruction, and a site of reconceptualization, right? Because again, if you go back to the idea of using a spatial metaphor, if nervousness is an act of, or is a moment of deterritorialization, we also know that every act of deterritorialization is also connected cognitively, structurally, and functionally to the potential of re-territorialization, right? So that entanglement is at work over here, which is also contributed towards the polyphonic presences of many selves in the intrafamilial setting in Dangarembga's novel. So we stop at this point today and we'll continue with this reading in a subsequent session. Thank you for your attention.